And we're live. Take it away, Edgar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Edgar Villanueva, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. I also have the honor to serve as the Chair of the Board of Directors for Native Americans and Philanthropy. I want to welcome everyone to another special installment of the Schott Foundation's Grassroots Education webinar series. Our webinars are an opportunity for us to engage with advocacy, policy, and philanthropic leaders to really think about and reflect on the work that we've accomplished together, share stories, and to think about the work that is yet to be done. The Schott Foundation is a public education fund that works to accelerate advocacy by helping to build, anchor, and support broad-based movements led by those most impacted, including students, parents, educators, and community leaders. Before we jump into our program today, I want to just make you aware of a few options for you to participate. We will leave time at the end of our conversation for questions and answers from our audience. So please make note of your questions in our chat box that you'll see to the right of your screen. We'll be paying attention to those throughout the conversation and reflecting on those questions toward the end of our call. We also invite you to join the conversation on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @SchottFound, SCHOTTFOUND, and to follow the conversation using the hashtag GrassrootsEd. Today, we have an opportunity to uplift Native American communities and to think about the gross inequalities that persist today as a result of our country's brutal legacy of genocide, theft, and racism. Education advocates and philanthropy can play an important role in the effort to reverse its own historical legacy of underinvestment and moving to boldly support Native-led change. Today, we're joined by our partner, the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, who are advocates for American Indian families in urban areas. Today, we're really thrilled, not to steal from Janine's thunder, she'll talk more about it with Joe, but we're really excited about the first ever national study to highlight innovative Native American schools and programs that have adopted alternative and culturally contextualized approaches to education to support Native youth. The report today that we'll discuss highlights some of the most promising educational practices within 6 select urban populations on behalf of Native urban students. We invite all of you to go to the National Urban Indian Family Coalition website to download a copy right now, and you're welcome to follow along and take notes as we're having our conversation. That website is www.nuifc.org. That's the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. To get started, I want to welcome our my guests today, Janine and Joe. We'll open the floor and have the two of you to introduce yourselves to our audience and just say a little bit more about who you are and the organizations that you represent. I want to start with you, Janine.
Oh, hold on. Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Good.
Okay. Thanks, Edgar. My name is Janine Comino, and I am the Executive Director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, which is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. The NUIFC was founded in 2003 and really born out of a need for urban Indian organizations to connect with one another, and has since grown into an advocacy organization that really takes a look at advocacy and policy for those Native people who reside off reservation and in the country's major urban centers. I'm an enrolled member of the Quinault Indian Nation. My father is Oglala and Quinault. My mother is Heshquit and Quackle from Canada. And I'm really thankful for the Schott Foundation for giving us this opportunity to highlight this really exciting new work that we have. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Janine. Also want to welcome Dr. Joe Hoeven. Joe, would you take a moment just to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work and organization?
Sure. Thank you, Edgar and Janine. My name is Joe Hoeven. I'm the president and CEO of the American Indian OIC, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We specialize in education and workforce development. My family are Umpapa Lakota, Standing Rock. My mother and grandfather are both enrolled members in Standing Rock. I began my career as a teacher here at this organization within our alternative high school known as Dakota Prep, and have since worked my way up over the years to occupy the hot seat now just very grateful for being able to participate and be a part of this project with the NUIFC and working with SHOT. And it's just been, it's been a kind of a load off my shoulders to be able to bring a spotlight to our work and so much of the great work going on at these other institutions that I've really been going after for quite a while. And now hopefully more folks will bring their attention to what they're doing, what they're accomplishing.
Thank you, Joe. I would love to kind of just help our audience understand exactly who we're talking about today when we're talking about urban Native American or urban Native youth. Janine, could you take just a few minutes to sort of describe who we're talking about and what the population of urban Native America sort of looks like?
Yeah. So when we talk about urban Indians, it's really sort of shorthand for lived experience of those Native people who live within cities or in the surrounding suburbs of cities. So for this particular report, we're talking about urban Native students. And those are students who attend public schools in these large cities in America. Essentially, we know that urban Native folks are the majority in Indian country. We know that according to 2010 census that 78% of American Indians live off reservations. That's an important number. Embedded in that number, we suspect that over 60% of within that 78% actually live within the primary metropolitan statistical areas, and are generally served by these organizations like the one Joe's the president of, these urban social service organizations that provide both social services and culturally relevant services to Native Americans who live in these cities throughout the country. The other thing that I would note is that in a recent meeting, I think it was someone from the BIE indicated that 92% of Native students attend public schools. So we know that this report is actually timely for these students and for for enriching their educational experience.
Awesome, thank you. I think that's a really important point to make. Often urban natives like myself, right, grew up in cities and often may, you know, be mistaken for some other race or not assumed to be Native or whatnot. But yes, indeed, there are Native Americans that are residing in all of the major cities in the US. And that's just something that's really important. So when we're talking about improving opportunities for marginalized communities and improving opportunities to learn for students, it's really important that we consider the cultural context in which you know, natives operate, so that we can make sure our policy recommendations and our thinking about improving systems really benefit all youth. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. I would love to kind of better understand some of the challenges that Native youth are facing, urban Native youth in public schools. Can one of you speak to sort of maybe some of the historical context of public education in this country and how, you know, as Native folks, we're oriented or connected to that history, just for a little background information?
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and I think, you know, part of this project that we're currently working on right here is just the next step in the journey of what I've been working on in my career and other folks. And what we've come to find is that for those that are involved in public education or education in general that aren't directly related to or involved in the American Indian community, they oftentimes are unaware of that history, that historical context that has set the precedence for how our community interrelates with the public education system. And really, there's been, it's a pretty hard history full of a lot of trauma, a lot of overt genocidal practices to deconstruct or overall eliminate our traditional cultures and practices. And so we really felt going through the work of this project that it was important to bring that historical context to full light. For those of us in the arena, we're well aware of it. You know, it's been impactful in our own families, but I thought it was important to spread that word so that those that may not be aware of it can understand that the key concept is that the American Indian students, and when we look at some of the data that's being yielded by public education, So often we hear that these students are failing within the system, and how do we help American Indian students? And the reality is quite the opposite. Our American Indian students are just fine. They're powerful people, and they're coming up on their own. And the reality is the system has failed them. It was never designed for their empowerment. It was never designed to empower our people or our culture. And I think it's high time that we turn that on its head. From the earliest days of the boarding schools, where children were literally and forcibly ripped from the arms of their parents, to the draconian and brutal corporal punishments that were exhibited upon our people within those boarding schools whenever we tried to speak our language or adhere to our ceremonial practices or customs. It was very overt in the early days about the oppression of our people. But this malingering disease carried forward into the 20th century, and we see it in a little bit more subtler and implicit forms, such as the curriculum that's used, either at best marginalization of our histories and our perspectives within the curriculum, at worst full-out omission or denigration of who we are as a people. And so to have to go into school every day and be presented with this kind of material, being denied to be who you are within that learning space, is toxic. It's a toxic environment. Beyond that, in concert, a false narrative was forced upon us. This false idea of an American that the cultures here present in this country, and it certainly doesn't empower indigenous culture. And so this duality of being denigrated or just flat out omitted while being force-fed this false narrative created a very noxious environment that isn't well suited for learning or the development of the youth. And then you add further indignities that on Friday Night Lights, they go out and they see the mascots of these schools as they go out and further denigrate our culture. So our students had made the courageous choice to exit the system out of self-preservation. And I think that history needs to be continually brought forward. And I think it's centerpiece to what we found in the journey of what we saw with these other innovative programs and what they were working towards, that they were born out of this environment.
Can you speak to the sort of how have public schools or how are public schools currently failing? Give some historical context, but what's happening currently that's failing our students, and how did this how did this all start in terms of the community-driven solutions? How did folks organize themselves to begin to sort of take this into our own hands in terms of improving opportunities for Native youth? Sure.
So along with what I mentioned about the hostility and open denigration of the culture, its exclusion or denigration in the discussion points, the public education system also adheres to a rather antiquated methodology in terms of delivery model. It's very akin to the industrialized factory mindset of cranking out citizen widgets after 12 years of forced matriculation within an institution. And I think in which the ways the classrooms are arranged and operate, sitting in rigid rows, there's a power differential that's heightened between those that possess the knowledge and the empty vessels that need to be filled by it. All of it is really antithetical to our cultural ways and who we are as a people. And so being forced to go in and matriculate within that environment, we'd have a understandably allergic reaction to it. It's unhealthy for us. And yet what we see in public education is that these delivery models are continually reinforced and perpetrated onto the youth, irrespective of cultural differences in learning or approach to learning. And I think it's important to make a distinction here between educators in terms of classroom instructors and teachers versus administrators and those that design the system. I think far too long teachers have been the scapegoats for some of the failures of the system. Teachers are going to teach, and they really, you could give them a pair of rocks and a scissors and set them out into a back alley. They'll find a way to make a science lesson out of it. It's a calling, it's a vocation. They have no choice to do it. It's who they are. So you put them in any type of environment and they'll make it work. They'll reach the learners and they'll engage the learners, and learning will happen. It's the administrators and those that the proprietors of this rigid industrialized system that I think need to be held accountable. And every time folks come along and talk about innovation or new approaches to engage those learners that aren't finding success, all too often it's a doubling down on the existing system. And I think when we see these alternative programs in these urban American Indian communities and what they've accomplished, it's inspiring. And oftentimes they're relegated to the background because they're not of the system. They've turned their back on it. And some of those techniques that they've incorporated or developed on their own really turn about what we see in a standard classroom: the learning space, the curriculum, who's present, how the relationship between teacher and student oscillates, it's not static. All of these things echo what we know to be true from our culture and who we are as American Indian people. It's very foreign to the established K-12 system. And so I think that's where we see this continued failing. And when we see massive legislation at the federal level, whether it's No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, or now ESSA, from my perspective, in my opinion, it's just a different shade of lipstick for the pig. It's not going to really make a lick of difference until they empower these communities to apply what they know, their cultural knowledge, to the educational system and delivery model, and turn them loose. Let them develop the schools that they want for their youth, and really kind of go into a subservient advisory role and let the communities lead. So I don't know if I answered it exactly, but that's kind of what we've experienced, through our journey.
Absolutely. If you're just joining our conversation, we want to invite you to take a look at a brand new report being released today from the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. The report can be found on their website at www.NUIFC. We are discussing a report, Resurgence, Restructuring Urban American Indian Education. And we have with us today the Executive Director of NUIFC, Janine Comino, and Dr. Joe Hoeven, who is the lead researcher and author of the report. Joe, we'd love to just have you to sort of walk us through some of the highlights of the report. There is a question that's come up, and we'll get to as many questions as we can later in our call, around just getting a little more specific around what, when we're looking at educational outcomes for Native youth, what are we looking at in terms of graduation rates or some of those standard outputs that people use to sort of, compare, opportunity or achievement for youth?
Sure. So, Strickland is speaking in terms of data, what we've come to find by examining the sites that we went to. And I think I need to qualify too, that the sites that we chose to visit are not the only sites that are pursuing this. There's other indigenized schools working with urban populations that are doing remarkable work, notably the Indian Community School in Milwaukee, and there are others. We just happen to focus on these 7 for the length of what we wanted to produce for this report, but there are others. But some of the data points that we see, the first and foremost, the tide upon which all boats rise is attendance and retention. And when you introduce cultural practices, incorporate our community elders, and diversify the age groups that are present within the learning space, the students find value in who they are, they find value as Indigenous people, and they have buy-in. And so the curriculum that's taught to them, whether it is specifically around the culture, or if it's the more traditional content areas of science or algebra, has a deeper sense of meaning, has purpose to it. It's not just an arbitrary set of learnings that somebody tells them they need to do. It's a tool for them to empower themselves and be the next leader of their community or contribute to the development of their community. And that buy-in translates into attendance. And what we saw within the schools that we visited is that there is a pretty high static rate of attendance and retention rates. They return to the school in the fall. They're there 80% or higher. And I know a lot of folks look at, well, we need to have 95% attendance. You need to be there every day, or we have parents in the group that want their students to be in school every day. But when we look at what the statistics are being yielded by the K-12 system, as it were, today, these alternative sites are blowing them out of the water. The students feel more at home, feel more comfortable, and it's really a more familial vibe that's occurring within these spaces. They feel that they're a part of their families, or the Teoshbe, the extended families, when they attend. And so once you've unlocked that, those tumblers have come into place and that lock is unlocked and they have high attendance rates, then we start seeing those achievement markers move forward. They complete more credits, they earn more credits. That's the next domino to fall, which then moves towards graduation rates. What we see, again, from the K-12 system, as it were, today, the graduation rates, which is in 4, 5, and 6-year installments, they're abhorrent. And they really are not suggestive that the system is working. When we look at the schools that we examined, we saw graduation rates at the 4, 5, and 6-year levels that were double those numbers. So obviously, those data points suggest that things are working. I think beyond that, the more qualitative assessments that we saw, which were the satisfaction surveys or the leave behind letters or stories that the students and their parents told about how these schools were often a point of salvation for their students to get back onto the track of becoming who they were intended by the Creator to become, speaks volumes about the power and efficacy of these schools. And so, through the course of this work, we really just wanted to put a giant spotlight on it to say that, hey, folks in public education, there are these alternative methodologies. We can broaden our thinking about delivery models, and it's okay for the system to take a back seat to the communities and really honor what public education really ought to be, which is community governed with local control. I think that's another fallacy that we often have imbibed and fallen under. And it really isn't. We see the system itself insisting upon its primacy, often at odds with what the community is calling for.
That's very helpful. And so, Janine, just for a little more context, some folks are interested, and so I'm very familiar with your work, but maybe you can share a little bit about urban Native centers and the network that you're working with, and how within the centers that you work with across the country, how is education a priority for a lot of those centers, or how do folks begin to organize in urban settings to even begin thinking about what Native youth may need so they can advocate for programs like that are featured in the report?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So the urban Indian centers that we work with, we work in 21 different cities with about 28 different urban Indian organizations. As sort of a generalization, these centers who operate within these cities, I always call them sort of tribal embassies within these big cities, because they serve Native people from anywhere from 50 to 200 tribes sometimes within one urban center. And most of them provide, some of them provide a dizzying array of services to their people, which range from child welfare to education to employment to health to, I mean, you sort of name it, and these urban Indian centers are seeking to provide those services to their people. A lot of cities have more than one organization. So, you take Seattle or Minneapolis or Denver, most cities do have more than one urban Indian organizations that's serving the needs of their constituencies. That's sort of the broader snapshot of what we call urban Indian America. As far as education goes, most centers have some form of education. Whether or not it's formalized is a completely different story. So the capacity that's required in order for these centers to really become a formalized education delivery service is often not there. So there really does need to be a lot of capacity building within the sector for those centers who are looking at being able to deliver education. This project really arose out of a series of conversations we've been having at the national level that really started in 2003 with our inception, when we asked urban Indian centers, in your community, what are some of the most pressing needs? Back in 2003, education was in the top 3. Fast forward to 2011 to 2013, when we did a series of policy roundtables in 11 different cities, and we divided them. We did one set of policy discussions with grassroots community members and organizational leaders, and we did another set with actual policymakers. Interestingly enough, and not surprising to us, was that in the communities themselves, education and under housing and homelessness have been consistently the top 2 issues that the communities themselves bring up as needing to be addressed within their community. So I think, so within the urban Indian sector, a lot of the work that gets done within the sector is really what I call reactionary. So an issue presents itself, an organization needs to find ways to develop programs to address those issues. Education tends to be a much harder nut to crack in that realm, simply because you have to have so much in place, and you have to have so much expertise and capacity and staffing and money and human resources in order to really pull off education, despite the fact that in almost every city that has a sizable urban Indian population, the communities themselves, the grassroots communities, are often really wanting and voicing the want for some sort of education or education reform within their cities.
That's also, so I want to jump into some of what those policy changes are that and the programmatic recommendations that are featured in the report. But before we do that, I remember what Joe just said around, like, you know, we blame teachers, we blame whoever for what's happening with youth. But I'm just feeling that, you know, in order to create the demand for these changes, it's really important that we build community power, right? And we invest in the infrastructure in these organizations and giving and building capacity in urban centers for Native people to demand these changes, right? And so that's a really, you know, and I might be jumping ahead for opportunities for people to invest, right? But that's absolutely a need to see any change that we want for Native youth or any youth who come from marginalized communities. Having that support for community organizations to create that demand for our young people is really critical. Could we highlight across the programs? So there were 6 cities, right, with 7 different programs that were examined. What are, you know, sort of the key programmatic or policy solutions that you all see that are working that would be great to take to scale for all Native youth?
So what we found in having the opportunity to visit these sites, who were just so incredibly generous of their time to show, you know, what they did, and which is featured in the report, was that there were some definite commonalities. And I think that was what the report wanted to really kind of focus on, is what's working, what's common amongst these sites. And by outlining or kind of showing these schematics, could they be scaled, and could they be replicated in other communities that are desperate for such services? And so the first series of commonalities really came about with their origin stories. These schools all kind of had very similar echoes of how they came about. And so within the work, we talk about how there was essentially a pattern of community immersion within the K-12 system that began with this kind of 4 phases is what we refer to in the work. It begins with this kind of genesis of a community critical mass where they're absolutely fed up with what they are seeing being produced within the K-12 system. And by the end of that evolutionary process, we get to a more community-driven model where they're calling the shots and essentially dictating to the K-12 system the types of educational models they want for their youth. So those origin stories were reflected within all of these sites, and I'd be willing, I'm not a betting man, but I'd be willing to put some money down that if we were to go to Milwaukee or these other fantastic sites that we didn't have the opportunity yet to visit, that their origin stories would echo how the community became involved and really drove these decisions and creative processes for these schools. Beyond that, in the schools themselves, we really looked at those common strategies, pedagogical strategies that are being employed. We've, you know, those of us that are in this sector, we've oftentimes talked about in utilizing Indigenous knowledge bases to empower classroom instruction. And here in Minneapolis, in Minneapolis Public Schools, we incorporate the 7 ways of knowing. And oftentimes this is related about learning and learning processes for American Indian students. This report really wanted to look at strategic pedagogical tools or approaches that could be utilized and replicated. And there were, you know, very similar practices that were in place. And we identified at least 7 that we refer to within the report that were being employed to varying degrees, to varying levels in each of these sites. And, you know, every time we would go and I would visit with the school officials, they would talk about how we utilize this particular strategy so the students will learn about this, or we utilize this other particular strategy so the students can then learn about this. And as a mnemonic device, I kind of hung on to the idea of these learnings. What are these learnings? And so in the report, we identified the 7 most common learnings. And really, through their application, I would argue that this is a way for a school to become, for lack of a better term, or for the proper term, indigenized by incorporating the culture in various aspects. And so in terms of broadening and deepening this impact, all of these schools are doing remarkable work on shoestring budgets. And to be able to amplify what they're doing, either through modernization of IT infrastructure, or modernization of curriculum that's utilized, or empowering them to activate these 7 learnings to a wider array of students by increasing staff sizes, you'll see these results continue to improve. I think beyond that, for those communities, I think particularly here in northern Minnesota, up by our tribal homelands, there's a real need for these alternative indigenized school models to come into fruition. And so they're going to need resources to be able to jumpstart these programs and have their community get engaged and get involved and dictate how they want their schools to look.
Could you get a little more specific for folks who may not be familiar with what any of this programming might look like? So what type of programming or wraparound support services might an indigenized school have that another school may not?
Well, I think what we found, these 7 learnings, which were the commonalities threaded throughout each of the sites, really spoke volumes about how alternative their approach was. One of the 7 learnings is the emphasis on learning out of doors, on land, and in water. Really hearkening back to what we know to be true of our indigenous teachings as stewards of Mother Earth. There was a preeminent focus and emphasis on getting the students outside in some capacity, in some fashion. More often than not, it was utilizing cultural practices. We have canoe races, we have going on rivers and lakes, or traditional gardens, harvesting traditional medicines, but the students were outside, out of doors. That was something that was huge, and to varying degrees, this was exemplified in each of the schools. Language revitalization, having the traditional languages taught within the school was absolutely integral because it unlocks access to cultural histories, perspectives, ceremonial practices. That was also emphasized, and we saw that. These things are incorporated to a certain extent within mainstream schools to the ability that mainstream schools can. These were the focus points, the focal points of these alternative sites. Beyond that, redefining what the learning space looks like. Sitting in rows within classrooms, a lot of that was kind of tossed out the window, that there's a more organic, familial vibe to how the students gathered and interacted with the educators and the teachers. Learning across generations, there was an emphasis on bringing in community elders and youth and commingling these various age groups, and again, disavowing the regimentation of isolating age groups, 7-year-olds over here, freshmen over there. And these, when we spoke to the practitioners at these alternative sites and as they related, they felt that this was kind of an organic development because of their origin stories. They were driven by engagement with their community elders and the leadership of their community. And sometimes they were not aware that several thousand miles away or on the other side of a mountain range, another urban American Indian community had come to those same conclusions, those same insights, following the same practices and employed the same strategies. So we're trying to sew all this together and to highlight the work that's being done so others can see and learn from one another that are already doing this or replicate it. So those are some specifics. There's more to it within the report. I don't know if that directly answered your question.
I'm curious about public schools that are looking to sort of implement some supports for Native students. In the models that you looked at, were there schools? Are these programs offered in an integrated way for all students, or are these sort of electives that are brought into schools for Native only students? How is the in terms of how Native youth spend their time integrated with the rest of the student body? What does that look like?
So for, some of these sites were actually alternative sites. Some are under contract with the public schools, and so students are free to enroll within them. And they're open to all because they're public students. They just happen to be predominantly populated by American Indian students, but there are significant populations that are non-Native that are attending these schools. In the school districts that don't have these alternative sites, they do offer this coursework. Native language revitalization is definitely prominently found, incorporation of Native histories. There is a specific curriculum in Seattle, since in time immemorial, which advocated sovereignty issues and teaching of sovereignty within public schools, and oftentimes those form electives that are taken by the students, but they're not necessarily mandated or required courses. And I think just kind of where my mind is flashing right now is maybe circling back to the previous question. I think where we see a need for policy changes or policy reform really is how we get those voices, those cultural carriers that can speak authentically and with the knowledge base our students need into the learning space. And that oftentimes comes down to lateral or expedited teaching licensures, getting our language speakers into the classroom. Those contracted services with community centers that are running alternative schools. Portland, NIA is operating under a contract with Portland Public Schools. Here in Minneapolis, our school, Dakota Prep, and now a center school are under contract with the public schools. That's not often replicated, and I think that in areas that don't have that capacity, some policy reform could be needed there. And then moving from elected courses to mandated courses, that this is going to be mandatory for students to consume, might be something worthwhile exploring. I'm not going to want to be too prescriptive because ultimately the community should decide for themselves.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the report at the recommendations toward the end of the report, and two are really jumping out at me because they are challenges that I think impact a lot of communities of color and are very important for us to be able to strengthen the organizing the advocacy infrastructure to demand this work, but also to have the resources to actually do implement this programming, which could be costly. One of them is data, right? And the recommendation is to get and use educational data from the mainstream public education system. Could you just tell us a little bit about a little bit more about that recommendation and how?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, part of it was born from my own professional journey, but then it was reinforced and validated as I had these discussions during the site visits for these alternative sites. Oftentimes when the community would come forward and express their desires of how they would want their schools or their delivery models to operate, they were kind of turned on their heels and patted on their head by the system, by the proprietors of the established K-12 system. And kind of, they kind of really just dismissed the idea a little bit because they were community members, but not professional educators. And oftentimes there was a frustration expressed saying they're not listening to us, they're not hearing what we'd want for our students. And they utilize their professional experience or their degrees or their careers as school administrators to kind of become gatekeepers about how innovation and alternative methodologies could be incorporated. And so one of the things that I talk about in the report is it's almost, I describe it as a talisman almost for the communities, is to get that educational data. No matter how much the system is, insists on its primacy as being the solution to the problems that it itself has created, the data points it yields year in and year out suggests otherwise. And so it's very important for the community to have access to the data that is available because it suggests and paints a picture that's pretty dire for the K-12 system, despite really some heroic efforts by some very talented teachers and educators in there. But you need to be honest about it. The system is collapsing upon itself because it's sticking true to its design principles, which was to disempower and disenfranchise American Indian people. But having access to that data, you can wield that like a talisman to defend yourselves, to suggest and further the need for alternative methodologies because it's failing and they have no real excuse. The numbers don't lie. I think beyond that, I think also with the data, as so often, and Janine can probably speak to this too, the overall data collection, not only in education, but beyond that for American Indian people, it needs improvement. There's more need for it, and who controls that data controls the narrative. And as long as there is inconsistent data collection principles at play, there's opportunity for obfuscation and deniability. And so when we can get those numbers, it's a very powerful tool for our community. It's a weapon that we can fight for our sovereignty against these systems that have enslaved us for so long.
Thank you. We are getting quite a few questions from the audience. Before we turn to some of those questions, just one last question from me for you, Janine and Joe. What would you all want to accomplish with this report? What would you like to see happen as a result of this new information?
Okay, I'll go. Essentially, this report, like I said earlier, was really born out of the expressed community desire to have education be a focus. So for the NUIFC, I think anything that we can do that sheds light on an issue that is near and dear to the hearts of the communities that we work in is really good. And I also think that, you know, and Joe can talk to this a little bit more, but I believe in his lit review that we didn't see any national publication like this about urban Indian education specifically. There's a lot of work about Native education, but not very much work that really focuses on those students who are going to schools in these cities. And often these students, I think, you know, emotionally, you feel kind of alone. I mean, I know I grew up and went to Seattle public schools, and yeah, I was one of maybe 2 or 3 natives in the school that I knew of. So, and I think that's an experience that I think a lot of our students have. And I think any time that we can focus attention on those types of programs that help our youth, whether it's a child welfare program or, you know, employment, whatever the arena, I think that there are remarkable programs that are happening out there within the urban sector that not a lot of people are aware of, and that a lot of communities really want. So part of the intent for us at the NUIFC of creating this paper was really to shine a spotlight and amplify those sites and those voices that are doing the work that so many of our communities really want to be doing. And so part of the creation of the NUIFC is really just that, is to be able to share best practices and be able to shine a light on those organizations that are often, you know, sort of quietly in the background doing this work for their community members all across the country. It's really to shine a light on that particular work so that other communities or other agencies can really learn from that work.
Awesome. Joe, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I concur completely with what Janine was saying. And I think for me personally, what we wanted to do is, number one, change the conversation about education innovation and educational reform movements. So often it's a closed feedback loop, a circle of the system proprietors talking amongst themselves, and to really bring new voices in from our community to say, hey, look what we're doing. So that was the first one. The second one is to bring relief or assistance to empower these schools and what they're doing even more so. They need resources. And I think if you spoke to any of the proprietors or administrators of these alternative indigenized schools, they will tell you within a heartbeat of what they need and how they can expand and deepen their impact, from staff to curriculum to resources to get out of doors, all of those things. I think the third point would be to validate what they're doing. So often when you're in the arena of alternative education, you're kind of treated as a pariah because you're not drinking the Kool-Aid, and we just can't do it. Just the same as a teacher has no choice but to teach. Those of us involved in alternative education, particularly those of us in the American Indian community that support and believe and honor our traditions and practices, we have no choice but to disavow the K-12 system. And so to bring validation that we see you, we hear you, we support you for these folks, I think is important. And I think finally would be to inspire those communities that have yet to develop these alternative schools and alternative culturally contextualized methodologies, to give them a roadmap to say, you can do it too. Your community leaders who are probably calling for this are correct. Listen to them. Don't be dissuaded by what the system tells you you cannot do. Listen to your heart, listen to your elders, and move forward. And oh, by the way, here's how other folks have done it around the country. See what you can take from that and make it your own.
Awesome. All right, so we'll transition to questions for our audience. We want to remind our audience that you can list questions in the group chat box to the right on your screen, or you can tweet your questions to us at @ShotFound with hashtag grassroots ed, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible in our time remaining. One question is, what are some of the resources and tools for educators or district and state leaders to learn how to operationalize these practices beyond this obvious great report?
Well, I think first and foremost, give voice to the practitioners that are in the field right now. They are the resident authorities. Oftentimes, they may not look like your prototypical educational professional. They may be community elders, but you need to hear them. You need to listen to them. And they're really, for those that are in the system, for lack of a better term, it's time to take a back seat to the community and let them lead. And I think by doing that, you'll see a lot of ideation being generated and a lot of new pathways opening up going forward. But you have to give them voice. You have to listen to them, and that hasn't happened. A lot of these, these origin stories, these 4 phases of community immersion that we refer to in the report, these are the communities out of just abject horror looking at these data points, felt compelled to act. They were never given a green light by the system. They just dotted up and did it on their own. And so I think it's high time now for the system to listen to them.
Absolutely. Janine, anything you want to add to that? Okay. And looking at, well, another question, a pretty good question here is, considering the current political climate that we're living in, what is at stake right now for Native students? ESSA was passed. What else is potentially at stake in terms of what's coming out of the federal Department of Education that could potentially be harmful to Native youth that we need to be aware of and push back on?
I think if I just jump in, I think first and foremost, American Indian sovereignty and the health, sanctity, and survivability of Mother Earth. I think those are the 2 that come right off the page. And it is our turn to be leaders in this context. And that begins with a sound, culturally contextualized education for our youth so that they can become the leaders that our elders had envisioned them to be. And so we need them to get after it. We need to provide a learning space in which they will be able to thrive. And they will enter into these policy discussions. They will enter into this political climate in more ways than we can possibly dream. And I need to be clear, they're already there. They're already involved deeply. We just need to further equip them with the intellectual gifts that will further deepen their impact, not only to protect sovereignty, but to protect Mother Earth, which is what we're here to do.
Absolutely. Another question is, what is the best way to address historical trauma through partnerships with educators, community leaders, child welfare workers? Are these schools addressing historical trauma in a unique way that's different from traditional or mainstream public schools?
Yeah, I believe that they are. I think one of the commonalities, again, that we saw operating throughout these schools was utilizing the concepts of relatedness, which is really harkens back to a lot of indigenous belief systems and community practices. And relatedness is kind of the catch-all term. Each school kind of had their own variation on this concept or their own terminology, but to understand that we are all related, not only between ourselves as human beings, but to our relationship with Mother Earth and all the living creatures that are there. And through that entry point, they can begin to unpack the trauma that lingers generationally from our relationship with education, but also the ongoing malingering effects of historical trauma, to create a safe space ensconced within our cultural practices to where healing can occur. There's some amazing work that's going on in these schools, and I think they have the right recipe. I think now it's time to get the right, to increase the amount of people that are there doing this. But that relatedness concept is very powerful.
Thank you. Janine, a question about the urban centers, the network of centers around the country. What capacity building supports are really needed to strengthen the organizations and the network so they'll be better equipped to advocate for opportunities for Native youth?
That's a big question. I would say that really it's the infusion of capacity resources that need to happen. So as I indicated earlier, a lot of these centers are doing a lot with very little. And again, the development of the capacity to navigate really, really complex systems for the creation of a school or the, meeting educational standards. This all requires a level of expertise that may not be developed in that community at this point. So really looking at, the infusion of resources so that communities and organizations can take the time necessary in order to develop those capacities, I think is probably the most important thing. I think that those communities that have programs and have a philosophy of really being able to bring in and listen to community members and be able to crystallize what community is asking for is also something that organizations need to do, which also, you know, requires capacity. So I would say, you know, capacity development and resource infusion around that, and very specifically for the development of formalized alternative education in cities that may not have it, I would also be looking at technical assistance. Folks like Joe or folks like any of these folks in these other schools who have done this from the ground up to actually come in and help guide these communities through these very complex steps. And then there's one other thing from your last question that I'd like to address as well about the historical trauma. One of the things we do know is that not all communities have a organization that will ever develop a Native alternative education, and so they're going to kind of be forced to work with school districts. And so I think at that point it becomes incumbent upon school districts to really seek out those Native organizations who can work with them to provide services around historical trauma. So whether it's, you know, a school district, you know, developing partnerships with these local Native nonprofits who really do know how to do that service delivery in ways that a school district just simply will never be able to do, and actually, you know, developing resource partnerships so that these organizations can come in and work with these families with whom they're probably already working, but really formalizing that relationship around that historical trauma service delivery.
That's a really good point, because we have some questions from non-Native folks who are participating, who are allies and want to do what they can from their vantage point to support Native youth. Some of the questions are around, like, what if there are only a few Native youth in our school? What can we do to support them? To, you know, really figuring out if there are ways that other communities of color who are working on culturally relative curriculum can you know, include our perspective in their work. So any more thoughts around one, what school districts can do to support Natives where there's not maybe a concentration to start their own sort of program, and two, how can our allies in the community and within the school system also, what can they do to really support you know, Native youth as well?
I think from my perspective, the lowest hanging fruit would be to examine the curriculum being utilized within the school. There are, even in this day and age, so much really antiquated pieces of curriculum that are out there that are openly hostile to Indigenous people. You need to take a hard look at what that is and make sure that you're not reinforcing old stereotypes or these old hostilities. The next thing I would advocate for is offering space, offering ability for these students to commune together, but not in isolation. You know, you can have non-Native students go with them, but we're going to have a space that is going to be highly indigenized. We're going to allow the occurrences that are developed within that student group to be driven by the students or by the community members. And then I'd also invite the community in. There's a real opportunity to dispel misconceptions, to reinforce critical thinking about the relationship of this nation with the First Nations, with our people, by having community elders come in and talk about what's going on. And there are plenty of current events issues that would be great fodder as a former social studies teacher. That would be wonderful topics for current events, from the Dakota Access Pipeline and the threat that possesses towards Mother Earth and Indigenous sovereignty, to relationships with the police and policing activities, and then beyond that, the mascot issue in professional sports. All of these are fantastic fodder or critical thinking activities for students that reinforce the identity of these Indigenous students and will ultimately lead to positive progressive change. And you don't need a specialized class to do that. You could just create a space for that to occur. And those are just off the top of my head. And there are folks in these alternative sites that will have an amazing list. And so give them time to speak and to guide.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We're still fighting against very Eurocentric history, right, being taught in classrooms that is not accurate. A question around, what do you guys think about mandating Native studies to a large mandating Native studies to at large populations, and whether this movement can extend nationally beyond sites like Montana and Washington State?
Well, I really am an advocate for getting our perspectives and our histories out. I am hesitant when words come up like mandating and being overly prescriptive. And I think that I get nervous around that because we can fall into the same trap of creating a system that turns a deaf ear to the needs of the community. I think in the near term, I think that having the more exposure to our perspectives, our histories, and our culture to non-native students is important and has high value. And I would see that to some extent, some mandating of that coursework would be necessary. But I get nervous personally because I don't want to become overly prescriptive. What we've learned from our experience and through the course of this work is the community has its own answers. So we need to listen to them and how they want to approach it.
Thank you. And I think this will be our last question, and then I'll offer time for you guys to make any closing remarks that you want before we wrap up. The question is back to where you mentioned validating schools that are indigenizing education. Do these schools have a mechanism for supporting each other, and is there a network of some sorts so that these schools don't feel alone in their fight?
Well, there are some tangential networks. I know here in Minneapolis, we have a very strong internalized network, the Phillips Indian Educators, or PI, which is an offshoot of the Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors Group. But nationally, the National Conference of American Indian Educators. But really this, in my opinion and my experience, oftentimes reinforces infiltrating the K-12 system itself and not just specializing in these alternative indigenized practices. So I would like to see a greater emphasis, if not a creation of a national network of these alternative indigenized schools to share best practices, to troubleshoot common problems that occur, to navigate political climates that can change and come and go either for their own benefit or it could be something detrimental. How can they come together and work for it? And really, most especially for those communities who are going to enter into this arena for the first time and create these alternative schools for the first time, they're going to need a lot of technical assistance. So I think there's a great need for that. Teachers have teachers' lounges. And I think there's also a need for these practitioners just to come together and dab their brows and hug each other and say, hey, I'm here for you. We got each other's back. So I think there is a greater need for that.
Absolutely. And I'll give a shout out to the Native American Community Academy based out of Albuquerque. I know that they are trying to support a network of schools that are doing some of this work. Recently had a conversation with them about bringing on a youth organizer to support Native youth change and, sort of creating more demand for this type of programming. Before we wrap up, do you guys have any final remarks before I just share a few things with our resources with our participants? Janine, anything you want to say before we?
I know, I was waiting for you. This always happens. This happens in conference calls too.
It's Seattle.
I don't have much to share except for to really thank anyone who's listening in for doing so. I think it's an important conversation. I think this is the opening step in an important conversation. And I think that, these cities across the country and these communities and these sites have a lot to teach school systems and educators and administrators. And I think, Joe hit it right on the head with how all of these community sites, the genesis of them really starts in community and with community discussion. So I think, school districts can take a lot from this. I think other community centers that might be looking towards developing education will take a lot out of this. And I hope it's really just the beginning of the conversation.
Thank you. Joe, any last
Yeah, I would certainly echo what Janine said and offer, Wopulataka, great thank you to everybody that was generous enough to spend their time with us to allow me to come in and visit and see what they're doing. Those that are participating here to carry forward this conversation. I just really hope that the community can realize you can affect change. Despite what the system may tell you or tell you otherwise. And in this instance, in this arena, we're calling K-12 out on the carpet and say, we're done with this. We're going to move in a new direction. And I hope that this yields more positive creation of these alternative programs and show points away for additional work to come in other arenas, whether it's the Department of Health or Human Services in these various states, that the community reasserts their dominion over these state-run operations that are funded by our tax dollars. So this is what kind of the title of the work, Resurgence, means, is a reawakening for our people to reassert themselves. And then, the executive summary, which will be coming out, is excerpted from a longer work. So if anybody's interested, I encourage you to go ahead and take a look-see there, because they really spend some time highlighting these really incredible sites that we're just so fortunate to have been able to visit. And of course, thank you, Edgar, and thank you, Schott Foundation, as well, for the opportunity.
Absolutely. If you don't have a copy yet, please go to NUIFC's website to download a copy of the report we've been discussing. A few of the resources I just want to call out for folks who are interested. Native Americans in Philanthropy, please, if you're not a member, you're interested, if you're a funder and learning more about how we can support Native youth, please look at joining NAP and check out resources and research on Native youth, as well as a fund that we have to support Generation Indigenous there at www.nativephilanthropy.org. Also, a great partner of ours, the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute, put out a fabulous report yesterday, brand new off the press, their State of Native Youth report, which is great reading to understand what priorities are that Native youth have, and really showing their leadership and change in our communities. And finally, we invite all of you to join Schott's Opportunity to Learn Network. If you're specifically interested in looking at moving more resources to Native communities to improve education, please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you all for joining us, and we really appreciate your interest and support for Native youth, and we look forward, like you all said, continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.